Thank you, Mitch. Pleasure to be talking with you again. Delighted to get back to our webinar series and focus on a topic which I think is of great interest to many people. How do we look at innovation management from a change management perspective? How do we actually establish these programs in a sustainable and effective way? And what does the roadmap look like as we begin to stretch our organization and get more and more people involved in supporting our innovation activities? By form of introduction, for those of you who don't know me, I run our Enterprise Innovation Group here at HYPE, which is the consulting part of the business. We focus on the processes associated with establishing enterprise online and inter-enterprise online innovation programs. Before working in this space, as I have for the last 10 years, my background is in information management and consulting. And I'm in a fortunate position to work with many of our big, complex enterprise clients on a whole range of different topics right in front of the bleeding edge of the innovation world. So a little sort of insight into my day world. My focus and how I describe myself, my job, is sustainable and collaborative enterprise innovation programs. And this will provide a bit of context before we get on to the meatier content. Each of those words are chosen quite deliberately. Sustainable, because one-off innovations aren't enough. Collaborative, because we know that our employees, the diversity of opinion that we have out there can help contribute to us becoming more innovative. Enterprise, because we know that just focusing on R&D or product development is probably not diverse enough to give us the rich improvements that we need to have bigger and more impactful innovations. And of course, as soon as we engage an enterprise or multiple enterprises, then we can suffer from scale problems. We can only fit so many people in a room. And so that requires some understanding of how organizations and people work together online, focused around business needs. And that's really where myself and my team operate, the people and process side of enterprise innovation management. So a quick introduction to HYPE. For those of you for whom the organization is new to you, just a couple of slides to explain who we are, which will hopefully put some context around the sort of things we're touching on today. We've been in business for 15 years now. We're a software process and services company, and all we focus on is innovation management programs. Sometimes that's within an enterprise, sometimes it's for a community, sometimes it's between enterprises or between communities. We're headquartered out of Bonn, Germany. We also have major offices in Abu Dhabi, in Lyon in France, and also in Boston in the United States. So we support the full life cycle of innovation management, and for those of you who aren't so sure what that really means, I'm going to show you a slide in a second which will explain that. And really focusing on, yes, a flexible and enabling platform that will help engage people, but equally, how do we make these programs fly? How do we really drive successful outcomes from it? And this is a range of organizations that we work with. Some of you may actually represent some of these organizations. And the point to really observe here is what do these companies have in common? Because they're, of course, from many different industries, different regions of the world. They're all companies that suffer with scale problems. They have a need to get people involved in the innovation or efficiency space and struggle to put them in the room. And that's a good way to think about how HYPE help organizations. This is our vision. Some of you may have seen it before. For many, though, I think it'll be new. And I think it really encapsulates the challenges that we face day to day, which is that once organizations have reached a certain size, there's a significant distance between those that have the ideas and insights and for those who have the power and resources to act upon them. And so what we're trying to do is provide both technology and processes that bring both the idea contributors and the decision makers closer together. And that may mean focusing on generating new revenue or becoming more efficient, but certainly is to help empower people to make a greater contribution to their organization. So this is the sort of full life cycle process that some of you will be familiar with. We tend to separate out front end and back end of innovation. And I make that point right up front because within the context of what we're talking about today, change management, this is obviously a big topic. And it's quite important for us to work out which bits of this process are we talking about when we talk about establishing effective and sustainable programs. Now the reality is we need the entire innovation portfolio to be addressed before we can really embed this into the DNA of the company. But likewise, it's also important to work out which bits are the most tricky, the most challenging. And today what I'm going to focus on primarily is the dark to blue elements, idea campaigns and ideas as a way of establishing engagement across our organization. Because this is the tricky bit. This is the more challenging part. And of course, there are challenges in adopting sustained back-end processes as well, but they tend to be less material. They tend to be more business as usual. The tricky bit of the puzzle tends to be in engaging people to share, collaborate around business challenges, and that's the part of the puzzle that we're going to focus on today. Now, you're welcome as you go through to submit any questions at all as we go through. Feel free to submit them. You may find it better to wait until the end of the campaign, to the end of the presentation to submit your questions, because it's likely that as we go through, I'll be answering sort of questions ahead as we go through. So let's look at the agenda for today. As I mentioned, change management within innovation management is a big and complex topic. But what I hope to do is take a slice of that subject and give you some real things to think about in terms of what that journey might look like in terms of adapting these sustainable approaches. And we'll start off by setting the scene, getting everybody on the same page, and working out which are the big meaty chunks of this challenge we should be thinking about. What are our big topics of focus? Then we'll discuss what good should look like. What is our objective? Where are we pushing towards? What's our end game? Now, of course, every organization has a different end game in mind. So what we try to do is aggregate the most common types of outcome that organizations are typically pushing towards. So don't worry too much if it doesn't exactly match what you're pushing towards. It's the principle that we're trying to show here. And of course, the frameworks that I demonstrate today can be quite easily adapted. And to play into that, we'll look at the major stages of maturity. What does each stage really feel like? So what's the first bit look like if we start establishing one of these programs? What's the next bit of the puzzle look like in terms of the various bits and moving parts that we need to consider? And then finally, we'll look at stretching the organization. How do we transition from one stage to another stage as we progress? So let's set the scene and get everybody on the same page. As many of you will be aware, as clients of Hype or people interested in the online innovation management space, complex organizations are trying to establish new corporate innovation programs. And as soon as we say corporate, that means enterprise scale. That typically means there's an online element. Now, as you'll be aware, just by putting a software tool in place doesn't mean that people share and collaborating necessarily in the way that we expect. So it's important to start thinking about, what does the journey look like? How can we get belief and confidence in this process? And how can we drive our organizations towards the major goals that we have, which are typically around growth and or efficiency? Now, you'll all be exposed to quite rapid and sustained change within your organizations. That change might be coming from market disruptions, from new competitors entering your industry, new regulations. And the thing that I hear most commonly working with companies is the rate of change is only increasing. And we're struggling to keep up with that rate of change in terms of opportunities, but also defending ourselves. And where that's leading to, I would say, more progressive leadership in companies is to think about how can we build more agile organizations that are more adaptive to the changes that we're likely to come across. Of course, we don't know what the future will bring. We may well have some theories, some ideas about what the future might look like. But building in this ability, this agility or organizational elasticity to be able to change those market circumstances is quite important. So this is the reason why organizations are thinking about involving more people in their online programs. Can we get more diversity of opinion, better quality solutions, better quality ideas, products, services, and look at our business models in a different way by harnessing the wisdom of our communities? Now, there are challenges, of course. We have to build belief in new ways of working. Simply by putting an online tool in place doesn't mean that people are going to share and collaborate in the way that we hope they're going to do. We're going to need to build confidence and belief in that process. And for leaders, not all of them will be feeling incredibly comfortable with sharing and advertising to portions of their enterprises what they don't know and where we still need help. So many organizations will start within a particular division with a particular C-suite leader who has a desire to solve a problem or reach out to grasp an opportunity. But the reality is many of their fellow leaders may not be quite ready to do that yet. There's also a natural contradiction, which really causes many organizations to struggle a little bit in the sort of medium-term phasing, which is that the mandate for innovation practitioners is often big and strategic. We're looking for you to fulfill the innovation pipeline for the 5 to 10-year journey, perhaps. And that's great, and that's absolutely the job that we want to focus on. The challenge, of course, is how do we build belief and confidence in the process if we're not going to see the outcomes for 5 to 10 years? When we need the people to come with us, we need the organization to come with us so that we can keep them involved and drive more and more deliberate diversity out of that community. Again, we'll come back to that question a little bit later in terms of how we might mediate and mitigate that challenge. The final point I want to leave you with is that many employees are not actually measured against their support for innovation. So that means they're not looked at on an annual or quarterly basis. What have you contributed to the innovation program? So that creates some kind of middle management tension. Why should I allow my group of people to focus on this new creative stuff when actually I'm worried about the day job? And these are challenges that I think many of you will face day to day. And of course, we need to bear them in mind when working out what our journey and our roadmap looks like to establishing these online communities. So let's look at what good looks like. What's the delta here? What is it we're trying to achieve, and how big is that gap? And I think there are many different elements at play here, but I want to focus on these 4. Leadership, culture and behaviors, the focus of the program, and the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. These are the most significant parts of the journey. And these are the things that, in most cases, also causes the most challenges. Now, there are many different aspects to also consider, but in terms of just giving you some useful content, I think these 4 areas are critical. So let's look at leadership to start off with. And again, I'm thinking about the end game. What's the aggregate opinion of clients in terms of what kind of leadership environment do they want to create at the end of the journey? What does good look like? How will they know when they've got there? Now, of course, innovation never stops, but building that community that's enthusiastic and supportive to innovation is something we can probably feel is different, feels better. And so for many organizations, having their CEO and their executive, their C-suite leadership group encouraging their employees, actually implementing the outcomes of their online programs is a big, big win. If they can see root and branch across the organization that the leadership of the company is focused and supportive of the innovation program, putting money behind new projects, investing in areas where we can become more efficient, they can see everybody's getting the benefit, they can see the outcomes, and everybody understands this is just an acceptable new way of working. And the next layer down, that tricky middle management layer, they also need to understand what's in it for them and be supportive of their teams joining in, sharing and collaborating on the topics and needs across the organization. Now, of course, in many cases, that comes alongside measurement and changing in measurement criteria. And we're beginning to get a sense that some organizations are starting to think about measuring their employees against contribution to innovation, but this is pretty rare. I would say 99.9% of clients that we work with do not have these sorts of programs in place yet. But this is a journey, and this is where organizations are heading to. If we move on to culture and behaviors, and actually maybe behaviors is a better place to start, there is no behavioral change without, no cultural change without behavioral change. And what most organizations are looking for is sustained support for their online innovation programs. And that typically looks like about 70% engagement over a given year in the sorts of campaigns and idea concepts that we're asking people to support. Now you may say, well, why is it not 100%? Why don't we have everybody supportive? Well, it seems to be that organizations hit a bit of a limit around 70%. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is we have headcount change. We have people, new joiners coming in. We have people leaving that perhaps would have been good supporters of the program. We have acquisitions. And of course, there'll be some people that stand on the sidelines or people that we simply struggle to engage due to their geography or working practices. 70% seems to be a very, very strong level, and only the most mature organizations get there. What that means in action is people are sharing and collaborating on things that need to get done. So that might be solving problems. It might be sharing ideas on the latest, greatest new product or service that we can offer. But they're supportive of this new way of working and are helping contribute to making the organization better. And it also means to me we need to be aware of these new people coming into our organization and build the briefing and the awareness into our onboarding process. So anybody coming in actually understands what the starting point is, and they should feel comfortable sharing and collaborating. And of course, we need an ongoing recognition program to keep reinforcing that this is valuable to the organization, we care about your contributions, and we want you to continue to do more of the same. Now, focus is a tricky topic. As innovators, we're often looking at longer-term time windows. And our jobs are often focused around big strategic innovations. In some cases, we have organizations that are focused on only disruptive breakthrough innovations, stuff that's completely new capabilities to new organizations. Now, the most mature organizations accept that, of course, but they also have a balanced innovation portfolio where the efforts around incremental, strategic, and breakthrough innovation are apportioned to what the organization needs at any particular point in time. And you'll perhaps be aware that there are certain golden ratios around the efforts associated with those three. In reality, the practical application is they flux quite a bit depending on what the organization is exposed to at any point in time. So they tend to stay much more focused on incremental in the early stages and then start to grow into the more adventurous areas as the organization matures. Now, it's not to say you should just click your fingers and go straight to what those golden ratios are. Sometimes you need to be more diligent and bring the organization with you. And often getting involved in incremental improvements on what we're already doing is an easier starting point for many. The more mature organizations have effective governance to monitor the progress and will shift the focus of the program based upon circumstances. So suppose a new competitor comes into the market, they will then help shift the program's focus according to that to make sure they adapt well. And again, the most mature organizations are beginning to put innovation curators in place. These are people whose role it is to make the most out of the existing portfolio of ideas. You must imagine, if you're running idea campaigns, you're generating ideas and concepts over time and year again, something generated over here may well have merit and benefit over there. Whose job is it to actually make the most out of that? Now, this is sort of a knowledge manager almost activity. But again, the most mature organizations are accepting that in a complex environment, something may well have a benefit beyond its initial purpose. And there's a role, or a number of people that should have a role, to actually look at how we can harness what we already have. And finally, outcomes. This is kind of the easier bit, and of course this is highly subjective to your organization, but generally speaking we're looking for growth, we're looking for material benefits, increased impact of the predicted innovation funnel. So again, it depends on your timelines, but if you look at an innovation funnel at one point in time and compare it to the funnel perhaps a year ago, what you should hope to see is progress. That means perhaps ideas and concepts in there that are worth more, that have a lower level of risk and a higher level of confidence in their predicted impact to the company's P&L. In parallel to that, we also need regular incremental business benefits. This keeps people on board. So even if we're working in pharma, for example, where our time to market may be 15 years from new idea to final drug in market, we can still keep people engaged. And again, we'll talk about how we can do that a little bit later. And often both of those go hand in hand with increased diversity in the innovation funnel. Again, building in that organizational flexibility and harnessing our capabilities for a variety of different topics. So just 4 different areas to think about, which is super helpful in terms of thinking about these different stages of maturity. So let's go a little bit more practical, and let's think about what are the phases that we're going to go through. And if those are our different work streams, leadership, culture and behaviors, focus and outcomes, what should we expect to see across these 4 major stages of maturity? So pretty obvious here. We're thinking about establishing a program initially, then creating some momentum, engaging a wider audience, and then finally leveraging that engaged community to its maximum benefit. And if we compare that against business value over time, what we should expect to see is a significant increase as we step through those maturity stages. Partly, that's due to the ideas that we generate in the early stages, being ready for market and out there generating revenue for us as we progress the program. But equally, it also speaks to the fact the organization has greater levels of confidence and belief in the process, therefore higher levels of engagement, more diversity of opinion, and more business value as we point that harness community on the various different things that matter to us. Now, most organizations will achieve value in the very early stages, but the really significant returns tend to come around that transition between stages 2 and 3. Now, you might see these different stages as a maturity curve, and it's not a bad way of thinking about it. It's not perfect, because of course people can drop out of these different stages if they lose confidence in the process or something else happens to disturb them. But as a way of thinking, it's not a bad way to think about how we're going to progress and how we're going to get us through that adoption curve. So starting off with establishing the program, Often that manifests itself with an initial set of idea campaigns focused on some relatively incremental or tactical needs. There'll be some support from the C-suite, we hope, some money, some resources, some budget for the outcomes. That's quite important. We're only typically asking questions at this stage that actually where we care about the answers. And very much we're showing by doing, experimenting, testing best practices out, seeing what works for us, and demonstrating the value of using online collaboration for the innovation work that we do and the efficiency work, finding some quick wins and of course communicating those. So relatively straightforward. And often this is focused on today job challenges. And what I mean by that is we try to solve problems or meet needs that people feel today before we start stretching them into the real new stuff that we focus upon. And I'll come back to why that's a good idea in a second. As we transition to stage 2, creating momentum, we're starting to increase the breadth and focus of the program, and that will include a broader range of topics, and more on that in a second. We're going to confirm the best practices and the approach that we're taking, making sure it's still fit for purpose as we start to scale this across more parts of our organization. Bearing in mind we have many different cultures, different regions, different skill sets, different levels of expertise, and often these communities will engage very differently with the topic of innovation. At this stage, we may also begin to build an advocate community. People who aren't on the innovation payroll, but are out there in the field in every corner of our organization and are generally supportive towards the program. They'll in part be issuing centralized viral messaging, so little success stories, little vignettes, little things to keep people interested in the topic, but also keep their eyes and ears open in terms of where the opportunities for innovation are. Online innovation programs are often managed by very small teams in very, very large organizations. The job's simply too big. So by building this advocate community, we can get a sense of what's actually required in all corners of our organization. It's crucial at this stage that we strongly communicate progress and outcomes. Has an idea or a concept moved from business case to proof of concept? That's news, that's interesting. That helps foster belief and confidence in the process. We also want to recognize high-value contributors. That again will help build confidence in the process. If someone's offered us great contributions that they're progressing through our pipeline, let's let people know they've done a great job. Because at this stage we really want to be developing the innovation portfolio, expanding by division or maybe country by country, and making sure that all the practitioners involved are following a relatively common set of activities so the experience for the employee is consistent across the organization. So moving into the third phase of engaging the wider audience, and this is typically the tipping point into really making some significant progress. We're going to be increasing the program's level of adventure, stretching into more adventurous topics. And the reason we can do this at this stage is we have enough credibility and track record that we can afford to fail. We can afford to try things out that aren't going to work because we've still got that ongoing bedrock of incremental improvements and new things coming forward. We can afford to experiment a little bit more and see what the organization is ready for and just see what we can turn up. We're going to be providing perhaps quarterly updates to the organization now, letting people know what has happened, what's going to happen in the future, and who's really contributing to this process and recognizing those individuals. And maybe we're a bit more systematic about sharing success stories and refining that advocate program with new joiners as the organization begins to adapt to this new world and more people get more and more interested into the program. In many cases, this is also the stage where companies start to include external parties, maybe suppliers or maybe customers in many cases. Now, for some of you, you may be interested in that on day one, and that's fine. But equally, it is also a more challenging space to execute online, going externally, due to the various different additional moving parts. So it's very common that this is the stage where organizations begin to start dabbling their feet into increasing the diversity of opinion by including externals. Our objectives really here are embedding the behaviors across the company, refining the approach, and again, increasing the diversity of the audience. And finally, moving into the sort of nirvana space where we all want to be, increasing the scale of the online innovation team so that we can do more and more and more and increase our capacity. And we're really addressing a full breadth of innovation and efficiency topics by this stage. And corporate communications are offering regular updates and news. This has just become the way that we work by this point. It's now embedded into the DNA of the company. And our job as innovation practitioners is really about maintaining momentum and monitoring the portfolio aligned to the corporate strategy. So when change happens, we can shift and we can adapt accordingly. Now this may feel a little bit high level, and I want to make this much more practical for you as we go through. But just being aware of these different program phases is certainly helpful, because we can look at these in relation to those 4 main focus topics that we talked about before. And we can look at a bit of a delta analysis and see how far we are from the goal that we have. And again, this may not match exactly to the way that your organization wants to work or your objectives, but this is a good aggregate opinion of what most of our clients are sort of pushing towards. So in the leadership space, we may start off with a single mid-level leader simply establishing the program, experimenting, trying things out, trying to generate some form of business value. Now, if we're in a stronger position than that, then that of course is great, but certainly we see as a minimum we need to be starting with that senior mid-level, single mid-level leader. And as we progress, of course, more C-suite will come on board. So perhaps sponsoring campaigns, perhaps publicizing their challenges and their needs to involve people, perhaps asking for people to help optimize what's already there. Now, it's fair to say that the C-suite will typically grow in support and enthusiasm at a relatively modest pace. Some will jump on board initially, very, very enthusiastically, and some will kind of just push back a little bit and just wait and watch, see what happens. Because these are the people that are putting their heads above the parapet and saying, actually, I need some solutions I don't currently have. I need to solve these problems, and I need to do things in a different way. And it's not for everybody that won't necessarily feel comfortable. And certainly some cultures will feel more reserved around that. Moving into the third phase, this is where the majority of the C-suite actually are actively engaged in a program in some kind of capacity. So the chief operating officer and their environment are going to be focused on efficiencies, improvements. The people that focus on products are going to be getting people involved in the new capabilities that we're developing, and so on and so forth. Everyone's going to see the benefit at this stage of involving more and diverse groups of people on the things that need to get done. And finally, the end point is where our CEO and executive group are supportive, they're encouraging the enterprise and implementing. They're putting things forward. Now, it wouldn't be unfair to say that some organizations actually start with a very engaged executive, and they're sort of somewhere between that third and fourth area. However, that doesn't meet all of our maturity concerns. That doesn't give us the full picture. There are these 3 other areas, these big chunky areas that we need to also address. So just by progressing to the 4th area in the leadership sense is not sufficient. We need to also care about behaviors. So at the start we may well be just fine with a small group of people sharing and collaborating on a challenge or need. A fairly significant tipping point is where you get about 35% of an addressable audience engaged. 35% is quite a common number that arises. So depending on what you're trying to do, whether you're trying to create something new or solve problems, those metrics will vary, but on an average about 35% of an addressable audience is a good indication of an engaged community. And if you have that across the entire organization, you can feel pretty confident you're stepping into that third space. We can say, well, that doesn't really reflect a maturity curve, that should be about 50%. But remember, the different topics that you're going after will attract different audiences. So most commonly, 35% actually does represent a really significant engaged community, even if they're only participating in that individual campaign at about the level of 35%. And as I mentioned before, that big step up to about 70% of the addressed community or organization is where, of course, we're looking to head. Now, those behaviors aren't illustrated unless we get the focus right. So we're not going to get those levels of engagement unless we have a program that has breadth of focus that covers everyone's different domains. So we might start off by focusing on tactical or incremental needs, but quite quickly we're going to have to start adding to the focus with more strategic topics, perhaps with continuous improvement activities, and simply innovate all aspects of our business. And this is quite a good hierarchy. If the leadership are supportive, then we can start focusing on the stuff that's of interest to them and start establishing those behaviors and pushing towards this more engaged community. And finally, the outcomes. What would we expect here? So initially, our objective is really quite modest. We simply want to generate some ideas that are going to match those sponsors' needs and eventually move towards a position where we can actually communicate significant business value, sure. But by the third stage, we really want to be looking at much bigger numbers, particularly in terms of forecast ROI with our innovation funnels and diversity of portfolio. So people can see that there is a variety of different options that we've got here so we can adapt to change. And by, of course, the end of the stage and where we know if we've reached a level of maturity where we have significant business value being delivered from our strategic innovations generated from this program. Now, I think it's fair to say we should always push towards material business outcomes on day one. But the reality is the really big numbers are going to be achieved only when all of these other elements have been addressed. So, as I mentioned, this is a simplification of the big steps that we have to go through, but I still think it's very helpful as a way of thinking about the different steps that we need to achieve. And different divisions may well progress at different rates. So it's fairly common for me to talk to a client and then to say, Colin, we have 6 divisions, 2 are on the sort of top levels of maturity, everything's going great, we've got great content. We've got 2 that are sort of a little bit lagging behind, they're somewhere in the middle, and we've got 2 that perhaps you're really struggling to get off the ground. Because the leadership in each of these divisions will push at different paces. They'll have different needs and they'll require different angles of attack to be able to really drive them forward. So let's look at that in terms of angles of attack and actually stretching the organization across these different steps of maturity. We need to try wherever we can to make the program attractive to all. And there are people on the outside, on the fringes of the organization, that simply will feel that getting involved in these sorts of programs is not for them. The word innovation itself isn't engaging to many. It's a buzzword. It's overused. Now, the reality is it's about what do we want to get done. Do we want to improve our products, our services, our capabilities? Do we want to change our business models? Do we want to become more efficient? Those are words and those are topics that people feel more comfortable with typically. And so we need to think about how are we going to get this program to a position where it does feel comfortable and attractive to all. And that comes through the diversity of the topics and actually angles of attack. And if we focus on building the right behaviors, even on smaller or more incremental topics, we can often then stretch the organization into the more adventurous spaces as they become more comfortable. So let's look at how that might work in practice, a very, very simple 4-stage process. If we give a group of people the ability to work on something that they already have as a point of problem or an opportunity, but work in a different way on a current challenge. For hypothetical reasons, let's imagine we wanted to take a new product to market. We have an outlined business concept that we're quite pleased with. Now, wouldn't it be interesting to ask all of the sales and marketing professionals across the organization, who eventually will have a responsibility to sell that proposition, what they think about it? Is it as good as it can be? Does it fit for purpose? Is it in the right kind of shape for our organizations and our clients? Well, often that's a really tough challenge because those sales and marketing professionals are perhaps spread globally, they're on the road a lot of the time, and they don't have a lot of time to go and sit on a conference call or all fly into a central location. We have a problem of scale. So we can do that online. It makes sense. There's no other way to really address that challenge. So let's look at something that we already care about and ask people to work in a different way. What do you think about this new business concept? And of course, for that group of people, they'll find they quite enjoy it. They're getting to see what their colleagues around the world think as well. And they'll begin to see the benefits through news and recognition. Of course, that leads to increased confidence in the approach. So the next time we address that same audience, we should find an increase in engagement, an increase in quality, and more enthusiasm for the overall approach. And if we've been through that loop a few times, we can then make a switch. We can say, okay, now we have that approach of sharing and collaborating online on stuff we want to get done established. Those behaviors are established. We're now going to make a step change. And we're going to take those established behaviors and work on something new, on a new challenge. And again, we go through that same approach. So that same community, we may start asking, we're interested in new ideas for new markets, for new customers, with new capabilities, a much more adventurous set of questions. But because those behaviors are already established and they've been through this loop, this new way of working, they then embrace those new challenges much more freely than if we hadn't been through that initial step. So a very, very simple way of thinking about transitioning people between these different stages. And you can map that against, if you're familiar with Ansoff Matrix, matrices, you can map this to that activity. So for those who aren't familiar with the Ansoff Matrix, it's fairly commonly used. I know some of you don't have 2x2s, you have 3x3s. This is the principle that I'm interested in here. We tend to think about innovation effort in terms of, is it optimizing our existing portfolio to existing customers, or is it stretching into new markets or new capabilities? Of course, the most challenging space often is to create something completely new for a new customer that we don't already know. So that's our initial loop. That's the conservative loop of doing something today but in a different way. And of course, once we've been through that, we can then push into that secondary loop of doing more adventurous topics. And you say, well, that's all fine, but what about if our organization isn't ready to talk about innovation at all? All we really care about at the moment is optimizing our business processes, and we're really on an efficiency and cost reduction journey. Well, it's not really catered for by Ansoff Matrix. Let's put it down here, our efficiency space. And we can focus on getting people in that initial loop in the efficiency space easily and then transition them into the innovation space when we're ready as well. So it works both ways. But it's just a nice way of thinking about how we're going to where we're going to focus people. Now, of course, the topics on one aspect, but the angles of attack are also crucial because different ways of asking questions will attract different types of people. We tend to think about idea campaigns as a very commonly used way of engaging these diverse groups of people we want to help address our topics. And there are 5 different angles of attack. Fairly self-explanatory. So a creative campaign, this is where we're trying to create something new that doesn't currently exist. Problem solving, so a known problem. We want to get the diversity of opinion of the organization fixing that known issue. A discovery, so we work for a large complex group organization, we have a large audience, and we might pose a question, who can help me with this? Where's the rare expertise? Where's the knowledge? Looking for relatively small amounts of submissions, but accessing the organization's intellectual capital. Testing, that's the example I just gave you. So something we're thinking about, can we test it with the likely recipient audience? And then feedback, gathering insights on the activities of stuff that we're doing already. Now these different angles of attack will attract different audiences. Some will be more comfortable with problem solving than they are with the creative space. Some will be more comfortable with the discovery or the testing space than they are the feedback space. That's okay. But the more diversity we have in angles of attack matched onto topics, the more different groups of people will find are attracted to our program. And this is how we start stepping up the level of creativity, because by engaging more people, we'll get more diverse opinions, more disparate concepts, more rounded concepts, of course. We can map these angles of attack to something we call campaign modes, batched against the efficiency and innovation space. Now this is a cut down version. The full version is available to any Hype clients, so if you don't have a copy of this already, please feel free to email me and ask for one. Unfortunately, it's not available for non-Hype clients, but I just want to give you an illustration of what's here. These are different use cases across these different campaign modes. So in efficiency, creative space, we may have maximizing profitability of a service or product that we're already working upon. Or in problem solving, we may have cost savings, or perhaps in discovery, sharing and replicating best practices. So even if you're in the efficiency space, you can still have different angles of attack on things that are important to you. And even if you're in the innovation space, you're really only focused on innovation, you can equally involve different groups of people by maybe running, say, a problem-solving campaign or a testing campaign. So where previously we might have only involved R&D, we may say, actually, we can now involve sales through a testing campaign or a feedback campaign. We can now involve operations through a problem-solving campaign. Again, pulling in more diversity of opinion that can be harnessed later on as the organization matures and we drive towards bigger and more significant returns. And so if we want to practically apply that, on the left-hand side, we might start off with a given community just focused on cost savings, because that's what that part of the organization is measured upon and cares about, and the middle managers will support. As we make the transition, we may say, okay, now we've seen those behaviors established, we now want to remove blockers to new offerings. What are the problems we're going to face? Because we can make a much smoother transition from going from the left to the right by focusing on establishing those behaviors and then stretching that particular group into a new way of working. So just to summarize before we move to the question phase, understand where you're heading towards and track progress. Now, as I said, my endpoints that I've illustrated here are more of an aggregate view. So look at your own and then look at those previous steps and see if they're relevant for you. But it's very important that you set yourself a clear vision, a clear topic, even if you don't communicate that more widely. And then track your progress. Are we still heading towards that same goal? You need to accept where you need to start where your organization is and not where you want it to be. One of the biggest causes of failure of these sorts of programs is being too adventurous too quickly. Asking a big, tough, adventurous question to an organization that just isn't ready for it. So if we accept where it is and perhaps go slow to move faster later, then we tend to find that you accelerate past the progress you would have made if you only go after the big, adventurous topics. And a way to do that is to look at those different angles of attack, those different campaign modes, to bring different groups of people and get more diversity of opinion on the stuff we're working on. And don't be frightened to stretch the organization by trying new things. You know, we're innovators. We're going to fail from time to time. We're pushing the boundaries. And certainly once you've got past that initial establishing phase, you're probably ready to try out and experiment a little bit more. As long as you have that ongoing, more conservative path of some more incremental improvements that will help justify your existence and generate some quick wins and successes, you can afford to experiment and try new things and begin to stretch into more adventurous spaces and see which parts of your organization are ready for the more interesting and adventurous topics that perhaps are more closely aligned to what you as an individual are really trying to get done. You know, and the best way of actually accelerating through these stages is to deliver business value. So even if that means delivering a small amount first to get to a big amount later, that will typically accelerate the process. So think go slow and then accelerate. And if you're interested in that principle, you can take a look at our content on our website, and an article that I co-wrote with a guy called Ian Ure from All Change, talking about these principles of innovation, leadership, and go slow then accelerate as a good way of progressing through these different stages. It's about a 12-page white paper, think piece, and I think you'd find it interesting. It's in the resources section of our website. So as you begin to think about some questions, please feel free to start putting them into the question box on GoToWebinar, and we will endeavor to answer as many questions as we can. So just give us just a couple of minutes where we begin to get a sense of what those questions are, and we'll start picking them off as we go through. So just forgive me a couple of seconds, and we will begin to start picking these out. Okay, so great question here. So how do we get people with different cultural backgrounds and from different disciplines using different research and development methods to learn, understand, and coordinate and synthesize in leading and managing the innovation process when they all see the world through different lenses? I think it's a really, really great question. One of the things to think about is people naturally like to help each other, but the day job obviously gets in the way. So in the early stages of an organization adopting these sorts of approaches, what they tend to do is to do actually relatively small amounts of innovation activities, but focused on topics where there's commonality, accepting the fact that people are busy, and if we bombard them with too many different things, they will simply get overwhelmed and zone out. So instead what we can do is we think about what are the big meaty topics where everybody has an opinion. What is it actually pulls this disparate, diverse, different cultural group together? And what kind of common challenges and opportunities do they see? If you can find an individual who is senior or who has some gravitas or has some power to change things, to start asking those questions that actually pull people together, then of course what you find is they will begin to start sharing and collaborating. Now it sounds very simple. This is a big, big question, a big topic. I'm more than happy to talk about this at more length separately. But if we can start focusing on the small number of topics that tie people together, what you tend to find is that they will begin to experiment. And as long as it's not too much of an ask of their time, they will begin to share and collaborate. Now, once you get those behaviors established, of course, what you can do is you can go beyond the topics that actually tie people together and start actually playing into that natural human behavior of wanting to help each other. We see this quite commonly in our multinational clients. We have a global media client who has many different operating companies, each in different countries. And they're all separate legal entities, all with their own P&Ls, and they have no reason to collaborate at all. So how do you get that organization to start acting on the benefit of the wisdom of its community? What they did was to start focusing on the local. What is it locally those groups are interested in? Even if they're super small, what is it that we can do to just to start establishing the same behaviors? We've got the long game in play. Let's start posing questions, focus on the local needs, start establishing the behaviors. And what they found is over time, that from time to time, they're throwing a curveball. Can you connect with that other operating company? Because they're kind of interested in what you do. And of course, over time, what they started to see is that people started to get interested. Oh, they're interested in what I do? Okay, I'm interested in talking to them. And over time, what they saw was this progression. Whereas before, everyone was only interested in them and their locality. By focusing on establishing the behaviors on the things that actually were meaningful at perhaps a smaller incremental level, they started to be able to stretch the organization. And suddenly they started seeing new things being developed and then being taken on board by a different division. Again, no reason in structural terms to work together, but they found that actually they could do it by basically going through the principles we just talked about, of focusing on smaller incremental topics, then beginning to stretch. Okay, let's look at some other questions here. In your experience, how important is executive business vision in this process? How far can you get without firm overarching vision? Yeah, it's a good question. There are two starting points that we see most commonly, those that do have the common vision and the big overarching vision, and those that don't. Now, then neither are completely simple, so I'm just going to sort of paraphrase a little bit. Suppose you do have the vision. Essentially what we're saying is that the leadership of the organization, the C-suite, are all bought into a particular strategic direction. And what that does, of course, is give us the topics and the mandate to go out and get people involved. Now, what it doesn't do is accept that we have a starting point. We have a current cultural position. And so organizations that do that typically progress through, say, the leadership maturity curves much faster than they do the behavioral maturity curves. And often it's the organization they feel is holding them back, but there needs to be an acceptance that they can only move as fast as the organization is prepared to go. So what that typically means is going quite conservative around topics, but that still head out on that roadmap around the strategic vision. Now, let's turn that on its head. Suppose you don't have that overarching vision. Can you still make progress? And of course the answer is yes. And I've seen many cases where an organization will simply start departmentally, and they'll deal with local, quite tactical or incremental challenges, and they'll show by doing. And they'll report back to the leadership and say, hey, look at what we've done over here. We managed to save this amount of money, or we managed to make this thing better, or we managed to make it more attractive to our market. And of course what happens is the leadership of the organization start to take notice. These people are actually doing something new. They're doing something different. It's actually working. And what you quite often come to find is that they were much more comfortable then starting to then expand that program out across the rest of the organization at quite a fast rate in many cases, because they can see the benefits, they can see success working, and often then the vision then comes once they can see what the opportunities are. Now, I said I'm shortening and paraphrasing a lot. There's a bit more to it than that, but neither scenario is actually perfect. They both have their challenges, and in many cases actually the second one can go pretty fast, pretty quick, as long as they focus in the right places, even without the corporate vision. But there's also a cultural aspect to this. I think that in certain parts of the world, these sorts of processes are more mature. So in the United States, we typically find organizations that are prepared to push on a little bit faster and already have that corporate vision, and that leadership arc is a little easier, whereas perhaps similar perhaps in Germany, but many parts of the world, there isn't that vision. And so we're starting off by just simply improving how we're doing things today, and demonstrate by showing, reporting it back, and beginning to stretch the organization. Okay, let's see what else we have that might be good to share. All right. Okay, any final questions before we go? I think we've dealt with most of the big sort of strategic ones. There are some sort of smaller ones which our marketing team will come back to you in terms of future webinars and other topics that you may want to address, but we have another couple of minutes if anybody has any final questions on this topic. Otherwise, what we'll do for those that are asking for sort of more information, we will come back to you directly.